Welcome, welcome, welcome. Christmas is creeping up on us, and today I'm going to show you some quick, easy Christmas card ideas that you can do at last minute to send to your friends and family. Now, if we haven't met, I'm Viv. This is Art with Viv, and I am so thrilled you're here. So let's get started. Let's go to the studio. The first card we're going to be doing is Merry and Bright, a sweet little cardinal in a nice little green wreath. So I just drew a circle for the wreath and I sketched in a simplified cardinal. I'm going to wet the paper first. This is a nice wet on wet technique. And then I'm just dropping in that juicy red right into the wet area and letting the water do the work, let it spread. Leave some of the areas with not as much paint on them so that they look lighter. Where you want the red darker, you just add a little bit of extra paint. And we're going to do the same thing with the body. Wet it first and then just drop in that juicy red paint and let the water do the work for you. It's going to spread and mix and mingle. And notice how I left part of that without any paint in it. I didn't drop any paint, so it is left a lot lighter, like a highlight. Then I got a nice black. You can mix your own black using brown and blue or any complementary colors that you would like. And then I'm just doing his black mask. I painted around his eye, careful to paint around his beak. And I did that while it was still wet, but I did let it dry just a little bit before I added the black. I wanted it to have a nice soft blend around the edge, but I didn't want the black to go too far, so I did let that red dry just a little bit before I dropped the black in. Now I've got a deeper red, a nice deep sort of a maroon red, and I'm going along his wings and back. And as you see, I am leaving some of the paper unpainted so that you have those nice white sparkles. We love a white sparkle with watercolor. We love some of that white of the paper to shine through. It just gives your watercolor a little lightness and brightness. And like I said, some sparkle. So we just did the same thing with the tail. We wet it, dropped in the red. And now I'm mixing up a nice sort of an orangey red. And I am going to do that beak with that orangey red. Now it's a little more orange than it is red, but I did mix some of the red in with some orange. And then just dropped it on that beak. And I did that straight onto dry paper. While his tail is still wet, I dropped in a little bit of that maroon, that more maroonish red for a shadow. And now I'm also painting in just some shadows along his wings. And I am lifting some of that color up off of his tail in some areas just to lighten it up. I'm painting his eye right in the center, but I'm leaving a little white ring around the outer edge of his eye and a tiny white dot in the center just for the highlight. Mixing up some greens. We need to mix some greens up. I've got sort of a bluish green mixture here, and I'm just going to use the belly of my brush to make some leaf shapes. So I'm starting with the tip of my brush and then just pressing down and dragging the belly of the brush across that paper and then lifting up at the end of the leaf. So it makes some really interesting leaf shapes. I didn't want to go with an evergreen wreath. I wanted some big fat leaves, almost like mistletoe, but not quite. So that's all we're doing, is just making some leaf shapes with our brush. Starting off with the tip of our brush, pulling it, dragging it, and then pressing down as I go toward the center of the leaf to flatten out that brush and make the leaf fat. And then as I come back toward the tip, I'm lifting that brush back off the paper so that it has a thinner, narrower end. And I'm just going around that circle that I had drawn out and just putting in leaves, filling in the area. I'm sorry that I pulled that down. You can't see, but all I'm doing is leaf shapes. The same thing that I did at the top. Now I'm adding a little bit of yellow to my mixture just to make it be a little different shade of green. Although you really can't tell from the camera, you can tell in person that those little tiny leaves are a little shade of green different than the first leaves. And I'm just filling in areas and fattening up that wreath, thickening it up where I think it needs a few extra leaves just to fluff it out some. Now I'm coming back in. My cardinal has dried some, so I'm coming back in with this darker maroon and making some of those lines and textures a little bit darker in the tail and around the feathers. Just to deepen that up, I've added a little bit of orange to my red mixture here. And I'm going to do berries. Now I'm just painting tiny little circles with little white dots in the center. So I'm coloring in or painting in my berry, all except for a tiny white dot so that it looks shiny. And I'm just going to sprinkle those all around here and there throughout the wreath to make it look, you know, more festive, and also to unify the wreath with the bird. The reds match with the bird, so that keeps that color going throughout the composition and gets this composition more unified with color. So once you get all your berries painted in, you will have a cute little card design. And this one took a less than 20 minutes from start to finish. So it looks a little complicated, but it's really not, because we've simplified the cardinal. There you go. That is so cute. Anybody would be happy to get that as a card, a nice handmade card. I'm just smoothing out some of those edges there. There we go. I like that. Now for card number 2, Let It Snow, Let It Snow. This is the most simple card of the 3. And what I did was I drew out some snowflakes. I actually used a stencil and just traced the stencil. And then I covered that with masking fluid and let that dry. And now I'm just wetting the background and dropping in some really deep indigo blue, or you could use whatever blue you'd like. I wanted mine to be a deep dark blue, almost like a night sky. So I went with a darker blue for my background. And in some of the areas where I wanted it darker, of course, I added more paint. I didn't want it to be a nice uniform wash. I wanted it to be, you know, a little bit mottled with some lighter and darker blue spots. Then I'm taking a brush with white gouache and dropping it into that wet blue, and that will be sort of like snowflakes that are off in the distance, little drops of snow just falling down in behind these big up close snowflakes. So that's all you do, is you're just wetting the paper, then dropping in some blue, and you're putting in, you know, some darker blues, probably right next to the snowflakes so that they'll stand out once you get that masking fluid off. And then taking a brush loaded with some white gouache and touching it to the paper so that it causes it to have those white blooms that, you know, sort of looks like snow off in the distance, snowflakes falling far away. And that's it. This one is so easy. And then once you get everything painted in, and I'm just sort of tilting it, letting that paint flow across that paper, Then adding in my white gouache in little tiny dots, different sizes. I'm going to let that dry completely. Once I get that like I want it, once it's dry, just get a rubber cement pickup or whatever that you use to pick up your masking fluid, your dried masking fluid, and be really careful that you don't tear your paper because that's a lot of masking fluid. Once you get all that masking fluid off, you've got a cute little snowflake card. Card number 3, shiny and bright. It's just 2 ornaments with some sprigs of pine behind it, and I already drew those out. I'm going to take some red, a nice bright festive red. I'm going to wet the paper first. My paintbrush is still has a little bit of that red paint on it. That's okay, it's no big deal because we're going to paint this red. So I would suggest though to use clean, clear water when you're wetting your watercolor. But for this one, I got away with it because we're going to paint this red. And so I'm adding the concentrated paint right where I wanted my shadows. And then I'm leaving like the lighter area as the highlight. And I'm just sort of dropping in that red paint right where I want it to be really dark. I'm trying to even up my little circle there. It's getting a little rough around the edges, so I'm just trying to take the tip of my brush and clean that edge up. I'm adding in a deeper, more maroon red right where I want the darkest shadow. And I'm just taking the tip of my brush again and just cleaning up those edges. Then I'm going to wet that second one. And I'm being really careful, or trying to be really careful not to touch that first one, that first ornament. As you see, I accidentally touched it right there at the top, and some of that red was bleeding into it, and it's okay since we're going to do both of those red. But you don't want blooms or backwashes from the second one to go into your first one. So as you can see, I left a little white line of dry paper between the 2 ornaments so that there wouldn't be backwashes and blooms. Or you could just let that first ornament dry completely and then come back and paint your second ornament. I did the same thing. I wet it with water first, and now I'm just dropping in the red where I want the darker areas to be, and letting the water just sort of pull in that red without adding extra paint so that we'll have the lighter areas. I decided that I needed to lift up some of that paint on the first ornament to have sort of a reflection there. Then I let that dry, and once it dried, I came back in and I started to do my little pine sprigs. And that's just, I just paint a branch and then just paint little tiny lines on either side of that branch and some on top of the branch to look like pine sprigs. And I just have them sort of coming out from an angle from that branch so that they look natural. And I will add some different darker shades of green into those boughs just to give it some interest there while they're still wet. And I'm just placing those around. And that green and red really look good together. They're complementary colors, green and red. Anytime you put complementary colors together, it really pops because they fight each other for attention. So the main things to remember is just use a couple of different colors of green in there and make those tiny little needles coming out at angles from that mid-center point. Now, if you're interested in getting an outline drawing for these 3 cards to download and try yourself, then you might want to consider joining my Patreon. It is only $5 a month for the dabbler level, and you get all kinds of bonus content throughout the month related to my YouTube channel. And I think it's well worth the $5, but that's up to you. You can check it out. I will link it below. And I'm trying to be sure that I'm not painting over my bows as I'm putting in my green sprigs there. You see, I just kind of painted behind the bows. The bows are going to be a golden color. I think that is the trifecta of Christmas colors: green, gold, and red. Well, traditional Christmas colors. Let's put it that way. There are so many beautiful combinations that people use on their Christmas trees, you know, nowadays, that I can't really say green and red are Christmas anymore, but they are the traditional Christmas colors. Put it that way. And I really like how these are coming out. I decided, of course, to add a few berries. I know it's pine boughs. Pine boughs don't have berries, but mine do. Or they don't have red berries. They usually have blueberries. But I'm painting this the way I want to. It's my painting, and I want you to paint your painting the way you want to. And again, I'm just trying to pull that red throughout the composition to unify it with some color and keep your eye moving around. So that's why I introduced red berries. I could have made it something else, but that's what I chose. So now I've got a nice bright yellow, and I am just doing that cap and the ornament holder, as well as the bow with the yellows. And then for the shadows in the yellow, I will come back with sort of a yellow brown while these are still wet, and just sort of put it in where the shadows will be, in the shadow areas. You'll see in just a second. I'm almost there, but first I want to get my base painting down, my base color down first, before I start putting in my darker yellow for the shadows. And here I'm not being really particular. I'm just getting that yellow down, not getting my panties in a wad about it. I'm just painting straight onto the dry paper. And now I'm going to come back with a little bit of yellow brown, little tiny bit of brown mixed into my yellow to be the shadows. And while that is still wet, I'm just dropping it in there where I want them, where I want those shadows to be. And that's all there is to that. These bows are simple, they're thin. Also doing that with the cap and the holder, the little hook, putting that darker brown in there. It just makes it have a little bit more dimension and look a little bit more realistic. I'm just going to add a little bit more greens in here, some darker greens, just to give that a little bit more interest. And I think those shadows could be just a tiny bit darker, so I went with a darker brown. And I was really fast with this, so it was still wet, so that it would make a nice blend. It wasn't a harsh, hard lines. If it had dried, it wouldn't have blended as nice. Now I've just got some white gouache, and I'm just going to paint designs onto the dry. Make sure your ornaments are dry. Of course, these are dry because we've been working on the greenery and the bows, and they had plenty of time to dry. And I'm just doing a nice little sort of traditional design on them, sort of a stripe with some, I don't know, it almost looks like a sweater pattern. And then on the other one, I think I'm going to do some vines. I think that would look nice on those. Just some organic vine type design with some leaves. And that is really pretty. The only thing I wish I had made that second ornament a little bit darker so that these white gouache decorations would show up a little bit better. But hey, you paint and you learn. So next time I will make it a little bit darker. Like I say, every time you put the brush to paper, you're learning something. I don't care how long you've been painting. And I'm just going to take some of this white gouache and add some highlights to the bows and to the little holders, the little caps, the ornament caps and holders, just to give it a little extra sparkle and a little another dimension. And I think that is really cute. Now that was 3 cards for your Christmas pleasure. Anybody would be happy to get these handmade cards. I hope you have enjoyed making them with me, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much for watching. It means so much to me.